Good afternoon, everybody. It's really great to see you all here and everybody who's there online as well. We're going to be joined by more colleagues and friends later this afternoon and indeed throughout tomorrow. So thank you all for making the effort. It's been a real pleasure corresponding with you all about your topics and trying to wedge you onto suitable panels and finding lots of interesting connections between people's work. We've just got a few thank yous to say before we start, and I will say them again at the end of the day tomorrow for people who are only here for one day. But huge thanks to UCL Press, to Ian who's in the room, and to Symbol who's around or will be around, who's been really helpful in getting things sorted out. Thanks also to the Society for Latin American Studies who have co-funded this along with the UCL Commonwealth Fund. Thanks to Radical America's Journal. That's me thanking myself in a way, I realise. And also to UCLA, who are the UK Latin American historians, who are this is in association with as well. You know, anyone who's made it possible for everyone to be here talking about these things as we are in the month of two important anniversaries, the 100th anniversary of the assassination of Felipe Carrillo Puerto and the 30th anniversary of the Zapatista uprising in Mexico. But we're not just thinking about those things. We're going to be thinking about all sorts of aspects of socialism and indigeneity in the Americas. Go back more or less 100 years with our history here, and then we've got lots of papers that go right through the Cold War period and up into contemporary Latin America and indeed North America. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Marieta, who's going to be chairing our first panel.
Hey everyone. The first panel is called Political Economy, Indigeneity, and the Modern State. We have two people presenting today. Is Chris Hesketh and Rafael Shimabukuro. So first I'm going to read, I don't know who's going to go first. Chris is going to go first, so I'll read the abstract. What's the stake in the plurinational state debate? The idea of a plurinational state is one that has gained currency in recent decades. Driven by the demands of indigenous social movements, countries such as Bolivia and Ecuador have rewritten their constitutions to acknowledge the diverse indigenous populations and make up the different nations within their state. The notion of a plurinational state carries with it the potential to offer an alternative set of cartographies and ways of being that challenge the Westphalian conception of the sovereign state. Furthermore, some view the plurinational state as a pathway towards a new form of communitarian socialism. However, in spite of this promise, there remains a major developmental debate between the more utopian horizons for plurinationalism grounded in indigenous territorial sovereignty and what I term in this paper actually existent plurinationalism. The latter has, in many ways, continued the colonial dominance of the nation-state in the politics of scale, as well as furthering the practical realities of natural resource extraction, both of which serve to undermine the material basis of alternative sovereignties and forms of political economy. This paper, therefore, asks what is at stake in the debate over plurinationalism and what possibilities remain for the decolonial radical impulse driven by insurgent spatial practices. Thank you so much. I invite you to present.
So to kind of kick off, if you cast your mind back to the early 2000s, Latin America was described by historian Greg Grandin as Empire's workshop, denoting how the region had basically been the testing ground, if you like, for advancing policies and strategies conducive to maintaining empire and the dominant world order. Nevertheless, I would submit over the last few decades, Latin America has equally been a laboratory for thinking about radical and transformative possibilities. From participatory budgets, the inception of the World Social Forum at Porto Alegre, the Zapatista rebellion, the MST, the Pink Tide, and countless more examples. Latin America, I would say, was central to the challenging of neoliberalism, but also more purposefully putting back on the agenda the idea of socialism in the 21st century. The idea, and indeed the practice of plurinationalism, I would say, is another such example of radical creativity. Driven, as the abstract said, primarily by the demands of indigenous social movements from below, Bolivia and Ecuador fundamentally rewrote their constitutions to acknowledge both the diverse, historically original, and yet still marginalized and excluded populations that made up different nations from within their currently configured nation states. The notion of plurinationalism then carried with it the potential to offer an alternative set of cartographies that challenged the Westphalian conception of state sovereignty and offered new tools for thinking about democracy and justice. Now, with regards to that latter term, justice, plurinational is a potential means of grappling with the legacies of colonial domination and the continuation of racialized state structures. In spite of this promise, though, there remains, in my opinion, a major debate between the more utopian horizons of plurinationalism, as it was originally conceived, grounded in notions of indigenous territorial, and what I term in this paper actually existing plurinationalism. The latter, the actually existing plurinationalism, has conjoined the idea to the state as a political project, and in doing so, I think, has in many ways continued colonial legacies, both in the politics of scale, as well as furthering the practical realities of natural resource extraction in the dominant forms of accumulation. In doing both of these things, the material basis for alternative sovereignties to be enacted have therefore been lost. So what this paper then therefore asks is what is still at stake in the debate over plurinationalism, and what possibilities remain for that original decolonial impulse driven by insurgent spatial praxis. My argument unfolds in the following three steps. Firstly, I'm just going to briefly set out the meaning of plurinationalism and the limitations of the dominant scholarship as currently exists. I then want to show why this concept had such a radical potentiality in a country like Bolivia, where the plurinational state was declared in 2009. And then finally, I want to explore the current contradictions and limitations of actually existing plurinationalism, with a focus on issues of contested sovereignty, as well as a debate between power from below and power from above. And I want to make the case in that section of why both the concept and practice of plurinationalism should be decoupled from the state to realize its true radical potential. So let's start with the idea of plurinationalism most broadly. From the Paris Commune, the Zapatista rebellion, to the ongoing struggles in places like Rojava, the left has long debated the potentiality of social movements from below in a communal form to challenge power from above society in the form of the state. In recent years, the concept of plurinationalism has added to that debate. Probably the most well-known scholar on this concept in the Anglophone world is Michael Keating, and he defines plurinationalism as follows, and I quote him: "The coexistence within a political order of more than one national identity with all the normative claims and implications that this entails." Now, while providing a variety of useful coordinates broadly around the idea of plurinationalism, I would say that Keating's work is fundamentally restricted in three major ways. Firstly, he focuses solely on transformations within liberal democracies, which are also seen as the markers of any new potential normative order. Okay, so plurinationalism within Europe is largely focused on within his scholarship. His work contains little by focus on popular agency and radical demands from below. And indeed, liberalism is taken to be the ultimate universal political form. His concern with plurinationalism is really about how those demands are mediated by already constituted power. Finally, as I already hinted at, his work is overwhelmingly Eurocentric in its nature. Therefore, as other scholars have submitted, emergent indigenous nationalisms remain both understudied and under-theorized, something I want to at least partially address in this paper. By contrast, I would say, if we look at Latin America, this offers a very different window for thinking about plurinationalism and is able to inflect the concept with a much greater degree of radicality. As I already mentioned, here it is a concept which is actively pushed, created, and debated by indigenous social forces. Now, as well as acknowledging the diverse indigenous originario populations that made up the different nations within the state, also notions such as living well, grounded in indigenous ontologies and struggles, have been anchored within new constitutions in both Bolivia and Ecuador. And these have been explicit about the recognition of the need to think differently about issues such as development and simply being in the world. Plurinationalism then, as a political project, promised to move beyond the limited recognition of indigenous rights that appeared in the early 1990s, so-called era of liberal multiculturalism and the era of what Charles Hale referred to as lo indio prometido, the idea of indigenous recognition, but within a very marginal framework of changing power relations. Plurinationalism went beyond this by explicitly advancing the goal of indigenous autonomy as central to the project of plurinationalism. In very broad brushstrokes here, plurinationalism provided the basis of a new political project that would provide both material recognition to indigenous territorial claims and therefore unsettle ideas of how nation states should appear and how they should fundamentally operate. In doing so, a different form of power, politics, and political economy was to be fostered through a plurinational project. And what I now want to do is to shift registers by looking explicitly at the case of Bolivia. Why does plurinationalism matter so much in a country like Bolivia? Well, primarily, it represents a major decolonizing impulse that stems from indigenous social movements from below. To quote here from the Pact of Unity, a leading conglomerate of indigenous social forces, in their document of 2007, they said the following: "We understand that the plurinational state is a model of political organization for the decolonization of our nations and peoples, reaffirming, recovering, and strengthening our territorial autonomy to achieve a full life, to live well with a vision of solidarity, and in this way to be the engines of unity and social welfare of all Bolivians, guaranteeing the full exercise of our rights." From that, we can take the fact that plurinationalism is a strategy that seeks to directly overcome colonial imposition, that is as an order that has marginalized indigenous people, as is uncontroversial to state. Throughout Latin America, state formation has taken place through the process of indigenous dispossession. From its birth then, the Bolivian state wasn't grounded in a sense of the national popular, but was a political project constructed against the majority of the population, as so famously documented by René Zavaleta in La Nacional Popular. Drawing from Gramsci, Zavaleta argued that the state in Bolivia was not an integral state, as is found in the Western European model, but rather an apparent state that lacked a sense of popular support and a sense of belonging. Taking up René Zavaleta's thesis, Luis Tapia identified what he called the non-correspondence between the Bolivian state and the lived reality of many indigenous communities within the country. And that non-correspondence linked to self-organized authorities, which, although were not a formal part of the state and have often been forcibly excluded, nevertheless remain both a source of resistance and of practical governance throughout the country. This is also what Fausto Renaga referred to as the problem of two Bolivias, a white mestizo Bolivia dominated by an elite on the one hand, and the Indian Bolivia on the other. The idea and the practice of plurinationalism is thus one that attempts to overturn the historical legacy of colonialism through a revival of indigenous territorial practice and customs. What is sometimes referred to as the Pachacuti, or the turning the upside down world of colonialism back onto its feet again. Now, since the 1970s, there had been a major revival of indigenous culture as a political movement, largely in terms of the failed promises of the 1952 revolution. Militant groups like the Carteristas and organic intellectuals associated with the Talla de Historia Oral Andina helped promote a revival of both indigenous identity and cultural practices to deal with that very issue of inclusion. Central to this was also the revival of the Ailu as a political form. The Ailu was a model and is a model of organization based on the pre-Hispanic past of indigenous communities, the collective ownership of land that is inalienable, and where kinship ties are fundamental to the political system. This indigenous resurgence, as documented by scholars such as Xavier Alba, led to a new conceptual vocabulary within politics, away from just class and union, and instead to words like community, right to territory, and the claiming of autonomy. Indigenous movements then fundamentally began to call for the rethinking and refounding of Bolivia. These demands included a transcending of the liberal and monocultural model of state formation based on liberal notions of individual citizenship, and instead asked to recognize the multiple nations and people within the geographical space of modern Bolivia. A break was also called for from vertical forms of power, and in its place were demands for indigenous autonomy, popular votes, the possibility of revoking mandates, and respect for indigenous originaria customs. Crucially here, autonomy would also include the right to decide on issues of exploration and exploitation of natural resources found within indigenous territories, which would link to place-based forms of consultation. Now, those demands taken as a whole were central to that period of social uprising in Bolivia from 2000 to 2005, which would ultimately propel the MAS to power. A new constitution refounding Bolivia as a plurinational state was subsequently passed in 2009. And this has been described as probably, and I quote here, the most extensive framework of indigenous rights ever recognized by a nation state. This was supposed to represent a possible transition towards communitarian socialism and offered a new beacon of hope in Latin America. As I've already mentioned, a key tenet of this was the right of indigenous originario people to self-governance. And this appeared to break, therefore, with dominant ideas of sovereignty and the institutional arrangements that facilitate that sovereignty. Instead, new popular modes of participation were to be fostered. And although new scales of authority were proposed, it was ultimately the community assembly that was to be foundational to democratic life. The explicit aim of the plurinational state was also decolonization, and this was codified in law at the time, and to recognize what Zavaleta referred to as the sociedad abrigada, or motley or heterogeneous nature of Bolivian society. However, right from the outset, it was clear that the demands of the national popular sat in tension with the demands at the community level, or what Raquel Gutierrez has referred to as the community popular horizon for emancipation. Central to this tension, I would say, is a very basic question. Who rules? Okay, so from the very outset, the original demands for indigenous autonomy were conceived as being parallel to state authority. They were to be, any conflict between those was to be amicably settled. However, those radical demands were instantly watered down and tempered by constituted forms of power. Moves to autonomy since 2009 in Bolivia have therefore taken place on a terrain heavily circumscribed by the state and where radical indigenous proposals become domesticated. A key tension right at the heart of the plurinational state has therefore been one of sovereignty. As many have pointed out, a key contradiction here is linked to the resource nationalist project of extractivism pursued by the state versus the promise, on the other hand, to respect territorial sovereignty, pluralism, and difference. Where the former, that is the state strategy, invokes an understanding of popular sovereignty, nationally based popular sovereignty against global capitalism as the key to decolonization, the latter understanding of plurinationalism remains concerned with the reality of internal colonization, which has largely resulted from practices of state-led development. As Nancy Postero has then argued, indigeneity in Bolivia has been transformed from a site of radical emancipation into one of state building and legitimation. Indeed, this was explicitly justified by Álvaro García Linera, key intellectual architect of the MAS. In his work El Estado en Transición, he argued explicitly for the stabilization of the system based on a state-based order. To quote him directly, he says, "No society can live perpetually in a state of generalized and antagonized struggle for power. Society sooner or later must lean towards the stabilization of the system, and here is important, or construction of a state order that returns certainty to the structures of domination and political leadership." Okay, so a state order is central to resolving tension, in his view. Famously, of course, in the imbroglio over the government's proposed highway construction through the Tipnis area, protected national park, home to various lowland indigenous communities, García Linera again defended the state's view on the basis of expanding the sovereignty of the national state. The proposed highway, he said, and again I quote here, is a mechanism for achieving territorial control of geography by the state and the establishment of sovereignty against what he termed hacendado patrimonial power. In this argument, note though that the social dynamics are reduced to one between a sovereign state and the capitalist class over territory. The possibility that there might be separable indigenous interests for territorial sovereignty and based on their own agenda for development is therefore completely elided. And this episode, I would say, is emblematic in many ways in which the promise of pluralism has been replaced by a single emancipatory subject and the politics of dialogue replaced with a politics of monologue. Plurinationalism, in my view, therefore remains an unfinished business and with competing understandings of what it might mean. The promise of plurinationalism originally was an idea, a method, and a practice to confront the homogenizing effects of both a colonial past and a present capitalism, and to reassert a political economy of unity in diversity. Beyond José Carlos Mariátegui's recognition of the survival of practical socialism within indigenous communities, plurinationalism appeared as a means of actively building this as a political project. Now, no one expected this to be a straightforward or a non-contested process, yet worryingly, it does look like its radical potential has now been arrested. Most importantly, therefore, there is an immediate political question to be answered in Bolivia, which is, can decolonization be achieved through the state? The answer to that question, I would suggest, appears to be no. There remains a substantive difference between political projects that come from the world of social movements and political projects that come from government-based programs and are geared to winning electoral support. There remains a challenge, therefore, to organize a mode of plurinationalism that is social movement driven and that has real respect for autonomy at its heart. A huge difficulty is how that form of unity can be constructed without a state form. A project that is locally sensitive, yet still multi-scalar in its articulation. A politics that remains place-based without being place-bound. Most broadly, More broadly, I would say, the struggle for plurinationalism also offers a window into social forces so often considered peripheral to world politics. Through the examination of the plurinational state debate, therefore, indigenous peoples can be recast, not as victims, not as simple recipients of global dynamics, as they are portrayed in much of the literature, but rather creative and active agents within world politics that are challenging established axioms and ways of doing things. The debate over the plurinational state, therefore, is one that is not over, but has the capacity to define the horizons of indigenous emancipation in the 21st century. Thank you.
From above and below. Planning for self-management in Villa El Salvador. In radical praxis, planning and self-management are often in tension. One imposes discipline from above, the other encourages spontaneity from below. This paper argues that despite real tensions, planning and self-management can be productively combined to build alternatives to capitalism. I do so through an exploration of the history of Villa El Salvador, a peripheral district of Lima, Peru, which was born as a self-managed urban commune during the country's peculiar revolution from 1968 to 1975. In Villa, two sociopolitical forces met. From above, there was the left nationalist revolutionary government of the armed forces, which provided the land and an ultra-rational urban layout. From below, there were the communards, mostly indigenous and inspired by a combination of Marxism, liberation theology, and long-standing communal traditions. What came out of this encounter was a remarkable entity, both radically democratic and democratically radical. The urban grid gave the institutional arrangement of the commune intuitive coherence. Strategically placed public spaces encouraged political participation at the lowest levels. Modern infrastructure was built with communal labor, adapting the practices of rural indigenous communities. A general ethos of solidarity permeated Villa. Yet, in 1983, a dual power right as Villa became a municipality. Throughout the following decades, the commune was mortally weakened by competition with the municipality, intra-leftist division, economic crisis, attacks from the Shining Path, and state repression. Today, little remains of Villa's glory days. Regardless, there are important lessons in Villa's history, lessons about how indigeneity might fit within socialism, how socialism might preserve indigeneity, and how planning and self-management can come together to create radical democracy. Thank you, Rafael.
Found quite a lot of really interesting things on the fieldwork. But basically, before we start, I think this is a really interesting example of two different things. First, I think there's a very long-standing debate in socialism about the concept of municipal socialism. It was very popular in the 19th century. Lenin wrote a very strong response to it. And there's this very big controversy as to whether municipal socialism first can work as just local governance, but secondly, whether it can also be a base for something more, whether it can be a base to actually challenge state power. So on that side, I think the experience of Villa El Salvador, which I'll discuss in a second, is quite interesting. But secondly, I think there's obviously this big debate about how indigeneity and socialism may be combined. And I think that in the experience of Villa El Salvador, you find a way in which indigeneity actually helps socialism, and socialism even preserves important indigeneity beyond what might have been the case before. So I want to start, I think this is how I should move it. Okay, I want to start very briefly with this very famous quote by Marieta, where he said that in Latin America, Indo-American socialism should be neither cult nor copy, but heroic creation. And I find this a really useful framework for understanding Villa El Salvador, because I find that in Villa, at least for a couple decades, you actually had a real example of heroic creation, a new experiment that was set up that worked quite well for a couple decades. But the story begins in 1968. At the beginning of what Hobson called Peru's peculiar revolution. At the moment, there was a left nationalist coup against the sort of reformist government of Belaunde. And you had this guy, General Velasco Dorado, becoming president of the country. He was left-wing, definitely. He was never a Marxist, he was never a socialist. And At the time, a lot of people understood this government as, quote unquote, a revolution from above, because he tried to change Peruvian society in really radical ways through things like land reform, for instance, but without necessarily having a social base to do it from the beginning. And in some ways, in order to preserve stability and internal security, rather in order to bring about communism or anything like that. More recent academic work has complicated this picture a bit because this government actually did try to encourage social organization, as we'll see, but obviously sometimes in ways which actually went far beyond what the government actually wanted. And yeah, it was really complicated government. Basically, from above, you had this left nationalist government led by the military, which was not communist, but was trying to fundamentally transform Peruvian society because it recognized that Peruvian society could not keep going in a very oligarchic, very aristocratic, very feudal way if it worked up to that point. So that was the context and the forces from above. And then the story moves on to 1971. And in 1971, as it happened for decades all throughout Latin America, there was an invasion of land in Lima, in a particular part of Lima called Pamplona. And this is a picture of the place. So it was basically just an invasion like many others that happened and would happen again in many parts of the country, many parts of Lima especially, which is the capital of Peru. But for whatever reason, this particular invasion actually became quite popular, and it started attracting a lot of people, a lot of especially things like refugees from an earthquake that had happened in Peru the year prior. And the sort of people that attracted were mostly indigenous. Actually, most of them were not direct migrants. Most of them had already been living in Lima for a period of time, but almost all of them had not actually been born in Lima. They often lived, they almost always lived in places like Barranco, which back then were like really crowded, really like bad quality conditions. And they decided to move into this land occupation because there was a chance to get this sort of new housing and the chance to actually sort of get some sort of stability for a lot of them. This is a picture of them moving to Pamplona very early on. So far, it's a very unremarkable story. It happened many times, and again, it would happen many times over throughout 70s and 80s in Peru. But what was special about this is that this became a really big invasion to the point that it actually ended up attracting lots of media attention. And at that point, there was about to be a meeting of the Inter-American Development Bank in Lima, which started sort of embarrassing the government a bit because there were many private developers who owned this land, especially Jesuits, or who were like sort of connected to the Jesuits. They were just actively protesting this occupation in the press right before this very important international meeting was meant to happen. And so what ended up happening was that the occupiers basically were attacked by the police, sort of trying to get rid of them. And at this point, actually, one man died called Eliberto Ramos. But the reaction from society was quite interesting because very quickly, the progressive elements of the Catholic Church went to the aid of the occupiers. This is a bishop of Peru at the time, Luis Van Beren. He was called the Bishop of the Townships. And he very quickly went to the occupiers' aid to the point that actually he was arrested by the police because he gave a very stringent mass in favor of the occupiers. And so the government was left at an impasse. They had tried to get rid of the occupiers because they didn't want to be embarrassed in front of this international meeting. They were also claiming to be reformists, claiming to be even revolutionaries, and then they were sort of using the police in order to attack indigenous occupiers in favor of these big landowners and private housing developers. And so what the government decided to do was they decided to negotiate with the occupiers, and instead of just kicking them out and forgetting about the story, to relocate them farther south towards Lima. So the government basically did that. They relocated towards south, they provided the trucks, and they sent them to a place really close to the very important pre-Columbian oracle of Pachacamac called Tablada del Urín. And they were sent there basically just so they could build their own township, their own town in this place south of Lima. But the government didn't just send them there, and I think this is where the story became really remarkable. The government at that point decided to actually really plan the way in which this place would look like. And so they sent them to the south of Lima, but they also gave them a really interesting urban grid, which looks something like this. So basically, it's a bit like Barcelona's super block, which are quite famous and quite trendy right now. But basically, the way it looked is there were I always keep confusing numbers. There were 24 lots per block. There were 16 blocks per this sort of super block, and each super block functioned like this sort of autonomous entity, which had, as you can see, like a park at the middle, but it also just had at the same time just a lot of isolation from the rest. And so each of these things was like a cell. And this was an arrangement that could actually be replicated quite easily over and over again. And so very, very quickly, actually, 100,000 people moved to Villa, also attracted by the fact that the government was helping them build this sort of thing, and just moved into this place, attracted by this sort of thing. Again, a really interesting sort of modular thing. And I think so far, I think it's quite an interesting sort of architecture and urban design story. But what I find really, really fascinating about Villa is that actually it went far beyond this. So this is happening in 1971. And very quickly, people start moving. At this point, this is a very, very famous place. You start having some leftist parties trying to join, trying to organize the population as well. A lot of especially Trotskyists, many of them, not all of them, but many of them were close to the government at this point, also tried to join the occupation and tried to start organizing the people within Villa. And again, Villa grows really, really quickly. But once it starts growing, the people in Villa realize that they have this urban grid, but they want to get organized themselves. And it is at this point, but again, also, it literally looked like this. So like, it was literally just entirely sand. Like lots of people, I talk to people now, they tell you stories of really early Villa and how it was really hard to get around because everywhere was just sand. Like you couldn't walk because your feet would just get trapped in the sand. But this was the way it looked at the beginning, even at this point, you already had the beginnings of the grid. But anyways, after a couple of years, when people start building really rudimentary houses, they also start building some sort of social organizations. And after 2 years, they build something called La Comunidad Urbana Autogestionaria Villa El Salvador, or the self-managed urban commune of Villa El Salvador. And this is really interesting because this is basically the way in which the social organization of the district, not the district now, like the town at this point, will look like. And basically the inhabitants get together and they decide that they're going to be a self-managed commune. Really, really interestingly, they decide on self-management. I think probably a little bit influenced by the government, which was at that point sort of looking to Yugoslavian and online movement, like self-management, obviously very inspired by Yugoslav socialism and workers' councils and that sort of thing. But basically, they decide to import their model of self-management and cooperatives and workers' council to a commune itself, to the way the urban will work. And they build this, what I find is really, really interesting organization that is going to run this place for the foreseeable future. And like the first time I saw this logo, I thought it was like really, really insane. Like it's not very clear. I need to get a better picture of it, but it's basically a rifle, lampa, shovel, a group of communards, and then a school at the back. I think very much, obviously everything within an industrial cog, very much capturing the spirit of the time. And then these are the community members themselves. Again, most of them are indigenous. Very few of them have any schooling. Actually, to the point that I was talking to one of the early schoolmasters, and the teachers themselves hadn't finished schools because it was so hard to find people who had actually finished schools. So again, it was a really interesting opportunity that lots of people from below took to take advantage of the grid and the incentives that the government from above had put them in order to build some sort of socialism. And again, at the beginning, they were unmistakably left-wing. I'm not going to read all of this, but this is basically their political declaration. By the time this declaration was written, this was a place with 100,000 people. What I should mention is that the way in which they decided to build this commune and the people that actually wrote this declaration that is so incredibly left-wing weren't actually, like, they were actually the people who were living themselves. Because as I explained earlier, there was, like, this was the arrangement, the urban arrangement of the commune. They decided to replicate it institutionally. So basically, organizations started from literally the block level. Like if you lived, like the 24 families in a block would then decide who would be their delegate, and then their delegate, they would get together for the residential group, and then the groups would get together per sectors. And there was this assembly where all the delegates from all the groups in Villa would get together and would decide on what to do about the place. And that is the body that ended up drafting this sort of resolution. But it wasn't just words. It wasn't just them saying that they wanted to be socialist. They actually tried really, really hard very early on to build socialist institutions. And not, obviously, at first they began doing things like building communal banks, there was a communal chicken distribution sort of network, also like petrol stations and that sort of thing. But they also worried about things like popular communication and about the arts. And this was a place that will become very famous later on, the Centro de Comunicación Popular, which has to this day actually has a really important radio network and that sort of thing. So they really tried hard to build basically a new city entirely with all its institutions coming from the ground up. And in this early moment, again, the spirit was incredibly radical and incredibly liberatory. These are some of the most important phrases from that time. And again, I think they're just like, in some ways, a little bit insane. The most famous one is no tenemos todo, le haremos nada, again, because it was a place where you were starting from basically zero. It was literally just sand. And so people were very aware that whatever they wanted the place to look like was the way in which it was going to look like. I've already explained what this meant at the level of like political declarations and really cool things like that. But it also meant literally like sidewalks. Like I've talked to people and they were like, because many of them had just worked odd jobs, many of them knew about construction. So like groups like the traditional blocks, they would get together in assemblies and like discuss how should we build this sidewalk. And people would say, oh, when I did it in this place, we did it like that. Somebody else said, no, but that's actually not the best way. This is actually a better way. And they would have these discussions about this that would go for hours. And they would eventually choose the best way to do it. And then they would just do it together with communal labor. Interestingly enough, sometimes they talked about that. I've also heard a lot, sometimes they decided to discuss politics and they would spend ages talking about the war in Vietnam and that sort of thing. Other one, Educación para la Liberación, was very, very famous and very important. A lot of them really valued education. And actually, as we shall see later, education ended up being really, really important for Villa. But also something quite interesting that actually was a slogan that was repeated quite often to me, sort of make me understand how insane this was at the beginning, was they thought primero fábricas que casas, which I think is just such a 1970s Marxist statement. But they were just really, really worried about sort of creating this sort of socialist model in the desert south of Lima. They were very, very radical. They were very aware that they needed to be very radical if they wanted to actually achieve the sort of goals that they wanted. And this is 1973 when most of these things are crystallized. And for the rest of the 1970s, these things work to an extent. I am aware that maybe I've been sounding a bit romantic about V, and I shouldn't maybe be that romantic, because very early on, there were also like things that were necessarily as radical as we would like them to be. Very early on, there was a discussion about whether housing would be private property or not, and the private property side won quite quickly, even though there were some people who wanted to make absolutely everything communal property. Even then, again, there were lots of communal mechanisms. There were things that were like for instance, oftentimes the community themselves would decide who would be able to live in a place. So oftentimes, especially I've heard this from women's organizations, if there was like somebody who was really sexist and a domestic abuser, the community could decide to just kick them out of the place and that sort of thing. Again, during the first few years, people that are living here, most of them are working odd jobs in Lima. A lot of them are actually employed full-time. So at the very beginning, the community is most focused just on building the really, really basic infrastructure, which they're able to do quite well. Again, related to this something I mentioned in the previous talk, oftentimes because, and I've been told this as well, because a lot of these people had grown up in rural communities, they had lots of the tradition of rural communities regarding things like communal labor, which made it quite intuitive for them to just like, it just made sense to do things that way, and they did do so. However, the more ambitious things, the things regarding like the community bank, for instance, or the thing regarding the community chicken distribution or the community petrol stations, it worked for a little bit. Everybody got a chicken at some point, but like didn't really work out all that well in the long term. Many of them throughout, especially the late 70s, ended up failing. But nonetheless, even though they couldn't literally build socialism in Villa, they were able to build they were able to get like water, especially electricity, schools, that sort of thing, really quickly, really early on, following this communal self-proposed radical model. So that was the 70s in Villa. Towards the late 70s, the government that was trying to help Villa do these things, that was trying to encourage Villa in this direction, actually fell to a sort of internal palace coup. And Villa became very oppositional to the government and actually became a hotbed of activity against the government. Lots of people in Villa would just march to the center of town and like demand the government call for new elections and that sort of thing. And actually, one of the Congress people that represented Lima in the 1978 Constituent Assembly was actually Antonio Aragon, who was an important Trotskyist, sort of aligned with the previous revolutionary government politician. So this is, again, at this point, Villa begins gaining a reputation in Peru because it's this really radical place that is really against the government and it's full of just so much activity. Also at this point, a lot of Marxist parties start joining and trying to come into Villa. And there are just so many factions. Like I've never met a Hoxaist, but apparently there were Hoxaists in meetings in Villa, giving pamphlets out and that sort of thing. But there were also like Maoists, many groups of Maoists and Marieteistas and many of those things. So this is the 70s in Villa, and I think in some ways this is the high point for radicality in Villa. Because what happens then is that in the early 1980s, the situation changes in some ways quite radically, although it didn't appear so at the time. Basically, what had happened was that Villa, even though it was this really radical commune, was technically part of another district of Lima called Villa María del Triunfo. And in the 70s, when you had this military government, that didn't really matter at all. It didn't really affect people in Villa at all. They were able to do this thing freely. But eventually, like the state came calling, and I mean, like literally, the districts began trying to collect taxes. People in Villa didn't want to pay taxes for this district, first because they didn't feel like they were getting anything out of it, but also just because they thought themselves as Villa, we are a commune, we're different, we're not the same thing, we should not be subject to this other random district. And so a group got together of Marxists and basically decided to write a proposal to make Villa a regular district rather than this really radical commune. Basically because at this point in Peru, there was no laws for commune. There was no legal framework to implement that within the framework of the Peruvian state. And they eventually were successful. They were led by that guy with glasses and the mustache looking that way, which was called Michel Azcueta. And this was a really interesting point that was also, I think, reflected in broader Peruvian leftist politics at the time, because that was also the time, around the time, when the United Left was formed in Peru. And lots of Marxist parties decided, because it became legal for them to do so, they decided to participate in elections, and they decided to form a coalition that was consciously participating in elections and whose main goal really was participating in elections. So there was a bit of a shift from more community building to just electoral politics at the same time as it happened. That is actually the guy with the glasses and the suit. That is Alfonso Barrantes, a Marxist, probably, who would be elected mayor with the United Left, like mayor of Lima. So a really high, like, electorally, at least very early on, it paid off for the Peruvian left to go into electoral politics. Like things seem to be going really well. But also, when this project passes, this guy is elected mayor, people are really proud of the commune. People really want the commune. So literally, the first thing the mayor does, according to himself, is say, ley comunal es ley municipal. So communal law is municipal law. Like, we are part of this thing. We have to be a district, but that doesn't mean we have to give up a radical tradition. Doesn't mean we have to give up the commune. If you talk to people from the commune side, they said that very early on, that was never the case. But if you talk to the mayor, he says he tried really hard. But anyways, one of the things that happened in the 80s, again, but there was still a lot of really radical energy in Villa, and just because this happened immediately didn't mean that the commune was destroyed at all. One of the things that happened was that the Marxist mayor of Lima created a program called Vaso de Leche, which gave loads of just basically free breakfast, a bit like the Black Panthers, I guess, free breakfast for children. And those things were organized by the people themselves, which was really cool. That was actually became really big in Villa, and Villa was a place where lots of organization towards that was done, especially by mothers. Those mothers would eventually get together in the 1980s, and they would form something called FEPOMOVES, which was the Women's Federation of Villa. What I should point out is that they formed this because they were getting organized by things like Vaso de Leche, but they also formed this because they were being alienated by leftist politics in Villa. Because the commune, while it had had things like general secretary, serving women and sort of thing, was in some ways quite a sexist organization, or at least there were very many sexist leftists within it, and lots of women felt like they didn't have a space for themselves. So they formed this organization, which throughout the 80s actually became quite famous. Going into the early 90s, it became quite prominent in Peru for a reason we'll see very shortly. Something else I should mention was that at this time in Villa, the Catholic Church was really active, but it was also really active in a really interesting way. Basically, I've talked to very many leftist activists from the time, and I would always ask them, how do you begin getting active on the left? And they would almost always say, I went to church and my priest told me, if you love God, you should also love your community, so you should get involved. And so at this moment in time, you had a really big network of churches that encourage people into social action and social participation. I think this is a high point of Villa. At this point, you had you had the municipality already, but the commune was still really important. There were really interesting organizations like the women's organizations. There was a lot of activity, literally starting from blocks and from parishes, and people would just want to participate, want to get involved, want to build a better world. Oftentimes, they just translated into joining a leftist party and not necessarily building communism in their day-to-day, but it still meant there was a lot of activity and a lot of organization. But yes, but unfortunately, this ended up falling quite badly for many reasons. First reason, I think, is definitely the municipality. I think the municipality, to use Lenin's famous phrase, was a bit of a dual power. And basically, the municipality, at the very beginning, it was very bare bones, but they eventually started getting taxes. And at some point, the municipality just stopped caring about what the commune was saying, because they really had no reason to care. Because the commune, back in the day, in the 70s, had been the decision maker for Villa. They decided what happened. They decided like what was built on the main avenues between the groups and that sort of thing. After a while, that became the municipality. And so a lot of people stopped really caring about the commune at a big level. They still participated because they cared about like what happened to the park in their local group, but they didn't really care about what happened like at a larger level. And so on that level, the municipality itself and joining the bourgeois state in that sense was quite weakening. Something else that was really weakening was the Shining Path. This is a picture of the what is now the municipality building next to the police station. And actually, it's really hard to find archives because the Shining Path literally destroyed them. In the 1980s, the Shining Path started trying to come into Lima, started trying to infiltrate Villa. There was a lot of suspicion about who was Shining Path and who was not, but even to this day, it's really hard to find. But they had a dual approach. On the one side, they decided to destroy a lot of the left, especially the left in Villa that had always been willing to work with the government a bit, say, the women's organizations who had organized themselves to give free lunches, which were paid by the government. The Shining Path saw that as collaboration with the class enemy, and they were really against it. But it was more complicated because at the same time, they often try to infiltrate them in really interesting ways. Something I find a bit insane, probably didn't happen, but a lot of people say it did, is that the Small Business Association, like PYMES, was actually for a year probably led by a Shining Path member who probably got into them by saying, don't you hate the bourgeois state? Don't you hate them making you pay taxes? Which I thought was quite interesting. But yeah, the Shining Path really, really hit hard in Villa, and it made it very difficult for people to stay organized. But it's not just what the Shining Path did. Yeah, actually, very famously, they killed this woman who's called Marieta Moyano, who was the leaderess of the deputy mayor of Villa for a bit, but also the leaderess of the women's organizations. And they killed her in a really, really gruesome fashion. And there's lots of recriminations and like rumors about this death. But yeah, they were quite toxic to the social fabric of Villa. Lots of people felt really alienated from the left because of that. But it's not just what the Shining Path did, like physically, it's also what it did mentally to the left. This is a picture in Villa El Salvador of local community people accusing somebody of being Shining Path. And this is something that happened to the left. There was just this general ambience of suspicion. You never knew if somebody was Shining Path. You never knew if they were criticizing your budget because they didn't like your budget or because they were following the directives coming from the Shining Path. And so there was just so much suspicion. And even to this day, I often hear that person was Shining Path. And then I talk to somebody else who knew them. And I was like, no, they were never Shining Path. That's just rumors from their enemies. And they just made it a really toxic environment for which leftist politics to actually function. But also, very importantly, this was the 90s in Peru. And there was the Shining Path, but there was also the dictatorship of Alberto Fujimori, which tried really, really hard to clamp down on the Shining Path, but also on the left. And things like community meetings of more than 3 people were forbidden. And it's impossible to run a commune if you can't meet with more than 3 people. And that sort of thing. And a lot of people were rounded up. Lots of social activists would just be sent to prison, basically, for no reason, just for being left and that sort of thing, which really, really weakened the left. But also, I think more structurally, this was just a time of rearrangement in Peru, in which neoliberalism ended up jumping, in which the projects of the left ended up losing steam, in which no real socialist alternative that was radical, but also feasible was articulated by any actor in the Peruvian left. So that ended up weakening Villa and the organization quite a bit. To the point that today Villa looks like the rest of Lima. The top 3 candidates in the last elections were Keiko Fujimori, Hernando de Soto, and Rafael Lopez Aliaga, which are 3 really far-right figures in slightly different ways. And Juárez, the headquarters of the commune, is literally now a market because it was occupied by informal sellers, which I think is quite indicative. But also, again, as I was saying, Villa es Fujimorista, this is my own picture. And it's full of really elderly women who run comedores populares, who really, really love Fujimori and really love the things he did in the 90s. So very briefly to finish, what do I think is there to gain from Villa? I think it's difficult because obviously it's not a socialist space anymore, it's quite right-wing. But I do think that in the 70s and 80s, there was really interesting experiences of how you can do planning and sort of ultra-rational state layouts, and how to mix that with activity from below, organization from below, and traditions from below. And yes, it ended up failing, but I don't think it was predetermined. I think maybe if there had been things like a legal framework for urban communes, instead of just forcing them to become municipality, things might have played out slightly different. I think a lot of it has been forgotten now, but I do find it a lot of really, really inspiring. So I think we should pay attention to what happened and learn from it, because I do think they're very, very important lessons. Thank you.